Have you ever watched someone make the same mistake over and over again and thought to yourself, how does someone not see this? Maybe it was a coworker who blamed everyone else for their failures. Maybe it was a family member who fell for the same lie twice. Maybe, and I want you to think carefully here, maybe it was someone closer than that. Here's what psychology says that most people are too afraid to admit. Low intelligence doesn't just affect how someone thinks. It shapes how they behave, how they react, how they destroy relationships, and they almost never know it's happening. Today, we're pulling back the curtain. These are the hidden psychological secrets behind why low IQ people act the way they do. Stay until the end, because number 7, it's going to make you rethink someone in your life completely. Before we go any further, if this kind of raw, unfiltered psychological truth is what you come here for, hit that subscribe button right now. We drop content that most channels are too afraid to touch. And if you've ever dealt with someone who fits what I'm about to describe, drop A in the comments. Let's see how many of us have been there. Let's get one thing straight before we dive in. This video is not about mocking people. This is not about making fun of anyone. What this video is about is understanding human behavior at a level that most people never reach. Because here's the brutal truth that psychology has confirmed again and again. Intelligence isn't just a number on a test, it's a pattern of behavior. And when that pattern is consistently low, it leaves very specific, very recognizable fingerprints on every relationship, every conversation, every decision a person makes. Now, IQ, intelligence quotient, is a measure of cognitive ability. The average IQ globally sits around 100. Scores below 85 are considered below average, and scores below 70 are clinically classified as an intellectual disability. But here's what makes this topic so dangerous to talk about in public. Most people with low IQ are not in the clinically disabled range. They're functioning adults, they have jobs, they have families, they vote, they drive, they're your neighbors, your co-workers, maybe even your friends, and they operate with a set of psychological patterns, hidden patterns, that psychologists have studied for decades. Patterns of denial, patterns of aggression, patterns of manipulation, not the smart kind, but the desperate kind, patterns that leave the people around them exhausted, confused, and sometimes genuinely hurt. So let's break them down, one by one. No sugarcoating. This is Machiavellian galaxy. They don't know what they don't know, and that's exactly what makes them dangerous. Let's start with the most well-documented psychological phenomenon tied to low intelligence, and one that you have almost certainly witnessed firsthand. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. In 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger ran a series of studies at Cornell University. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. People with low competence in a subject consistently overestimate their own ability. Not slightly. Dramatically. Think about that. The less someone actually knows, the more confident they are that they know everything. Now here's where it gets personal. You've seen this person. Maybe you've argued with this person, the one who has never read a single book on the topic, but speaks with absolute certainty, the one who gets their information from a Facebook post and treats it like a PhD thesis, the one who, when challenged with actual evidence, doesn't reconsider, they double down. Why do they double down? Because they lack the cognitive machinery to recognize their own ignorance. And this isn't me being harsh. This is the actual psychological mechanism. Dunning himself said, "The skills you need to produce a correct answer are exactly the skills you need to recognize what a correct answer is." In other words, if you can't think well, you can't even tell that you're thinking poorly. Here's a real-world example. Imagine a new employee who's been on the job for 3 weeks. They walk into a meeting and start correcting the manager, a person with 15 years of experience, with total confidence. Everyone in the room is stunned. But that employee? They walk out feeling great, feeling smart. That's Dunning-Kruger in action. And here's the emotional weight of this. Because it's not just annoying. It's painful when this person is someone you love. When your partner is completely convinced they're always right, when your parent refuses to ever accept your perspective, when your friend dismisses your advice before you finish the sentence. It's not arrogance in the traditional sense. It's a cognitive limitation wearing the costume of arrogance, and that distinction matters because one you can reason with, the other you cannot. How to handle it? Psychology suggests that direct confrontation almost never works with high Dunning-Kruger individuals. Their brain literally cannot process the gap between perception and reality that you're trying to show them. The strategic move. Socratic questioning. Don't tell them they're wrong. Ask questions that lead them to the contradiction themselves. It's slower. It's frustrating. But it's the only method that has any chance of penetrating the wall. And if even that doesn't work, sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is walk away from the conversation entirely. They don't argue with facts, they argue with feelings, and they always win, because feelings don't need evidence. Here's something that will immediately make sense once I say it. Low IQ individuals rely almost exclusively on emotional reasoning, not because they choose to, but because abstract, logical thinking requires a level of cognitive processing that is genuinely difficult for them. Psychologists call this affect-driven decision-making, and in low-intelligence individuals, it's not a style, it's the only mode they have. What does this look like in real life? You're having a disagreement. You come with facts, data, logic, examples. You're calm, you're structured, you're making sense. And then they say something like, well, I just feel like you're wrong, or they completely change the subject, or they bring up something from 3 years ago, or, and this is the classic, they start crying or shouting or storming out of the room. This is not manipulation in the Machiavellian, calculated sense. This is a cognitive escape hatch. When the logical path becomes too demanding for their brain to process, the emotional system takes over entirely. It's almost like a circuit breaker flipping. Here's the part that makes this genuinely heartbreaking sometimes. They're not always doing it on purpose. Research from the Journal of Intelligence has shown that lower cognitive ability is significantly correlated with difficulty in emotional regulation. The brain structures responsible for higher reasoning, the prefrontal cortex, are the same structures that help regulate emotional responses. If one is underdeveloped, both suffer. So when someone with low intelligence loses their temper in a discussion, they're not just being difficult. Their brain is literally struggling to hold the emotional and logical systems together simultaneously. But understanding this doesn't mean you have to accept it as a permanent dynamic in your life. Think about the last time you tried to have a serious conversation with someone who kept deflecting emotionally. Maybe it was about finances. Maybe it was about a relationship problem. Maybe it was about something as simple as dividing responsibilities at home. And no matter how carefully you framed your point, it dissolved into chaos, into blame, into tears or anger that had nothing to do with the original issue. That's emotional hijacking, and it's exhausting. What psychology recommends? Keep the conversation short and concrete. Abstract discussions are a minefield. Speak in simple, specific terms, one point at a time, and give them time to emotionally regulate before continuing. Pushing through when they've been emotionally triggered will never produce a rational result. Also, and this is important, protect your own emotional state. Prolonged exposure to emotionally dysregulated individuals has measurable effects on your own stress levels, cortisol production, and long-term mental health. Know when the conversation is over, not because you gave up, but because you understood the game. Nothing is ever their fault, and the tragedy is they genuinely believe that. If there is one behavioral signature that appears almost universally in low-intelligence individuals, it is an externalizing blame style. What does that mean? It means everything bad that happens to them is someone else's fault. The job loss, the boss was jealous, the failed relationship, their partner was toxic, the financial disaster, the system is rigged, the friendship that ended, that person was always fake. Now, I want to be careful here, because systemic injustice is real. Sometimes life genuinely is unfair, sometimes people are dealt a bad hand. But what psychologists have observed in low cognitive ability individuals is a consistent, automatic, reflexive pattern of external attribution, regardless of the actual circumstances. Why does this happen? 2 reasons. First, self-reflection requires metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. And metacognition is one of the first casualties of lower intelligence. If you can't examine your own thought process, you cannot trace a failure back to a decision you made. Second, ego protection, the psychological pain of admitting fault, especially for someone who already feels inferior or uncertain. is too overwhelming. The mind reroutes the blame outward as a defense mechanism. Here's what makes this dangerous for the people around them. If they are never responsible, then you always are. You become the scapegoat. Your actions, your words, your tone, your timing, everything becomes ammunition for why you caused the problem. And over time, if you're not careful, you start to believe it. This is how intelligent, capable people end up in relationships, romantic, professional, or familial, where they constantly feel guilty for things that were never their fault. Psychology calls this DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. It's a pattern seen frequently in individuals with low self-awareness and limited cognitive flexibility. The protection strategy: document reality, not obsessively, but consciously. When you're in a relationship or environment where blame is constantly redirected at you, keeping a clear mental or even written record of events helps you maintain your grip on reality. And remember, you cannot fix someone's blame architecture from the outside. It's an internal cognitive structure. The only person who can change it is them, and that requires self-awareness they may not possess. Complex problems have simple villains. That's not intelligence, that's a coping mechanism. Here's a pattern that has become alarmingly visible in the modern world, and psychology has a very clear explanation for it. Low-intelligence individuals are significantly more drawn to conspiracy theories and oversimplified explanations. And before you click away thinking this is a political statement, it is not. This is pure cognitive psychology. Research published in Applied Cognitive Psychology found a strong negative correlation between analytic thinking and belief in conspiracy theories. The lower the analytical intelligence, the higher the susceptibility to conspiratorial thinking. Why? Because the real world is complex. Markets crash due to interconnected systems of supply, demand, geopolitical pressure, and human psychology. Diseases spread due to viral biology, population density, and behavioral patterns. Social problems are shaped by centuries of cultural, economic, and historical forces. That level of complexity is cognitively expensive to process. So the low IQ brain does something elegant in a tragic way. It simplifies. It finds a villain. It builds a narrative where one group, one person, one hidden power is responsible for everything. It's not stupidity in a mocking sense. It's the brain doing the best it can with limited processing power. Finding patterns, even false ones, feels better than sitting with the discomfort of genuine complexity. The problem? These simplified narratives spread, and they spread fast, because emotionally they're satisfying. They give people a target for their frustration. They create community around shared suspicion. They're psychologically rewarding in ways that nuanced, accurate information is not. You've seen this in comment sections. You've seen this at family dinners. That uncle who has an explanation for everything, and it always involves a secret group pulling the strings. He's not evil. He's cognitively overwhelmed by a world that moves too fast and thinks too deep, and the conspiracy is his map. How to respond? Don't attack the conspiracy directly. That triggers defensiveness and cements belief. Instead, ask questions about the explanation itself. That's interesting. What would have to be true for that to work? Often the theory collapses under its own weight when examined gently. But be realistic. Once someone's identity is wrapped around a belief system, intelligence or not, change is rare. Protect your own reasoning. Don't let their simplified worldview infect yours. They learned the words. They never learned the music. This one is subtle, and it's one of the most psychologically fascinating signs of low intelligence, because from the outside, it looks almost normal. It's called surface-level social mimicry. Here's what it means. Low IQ individuals often learn what to say in social situations without understanding why it's said. They copy the behavior. They don't grasp the principle beneath it. Think about someone who's learned that being nice means agreeing with people. So they agree, constantly, automatically, with everyone. Not because they're actually considering what's being said, but because agreeing social acceptance is a rule they've memorized. Or someone who's learned that humor is a way to connect with people, so they make jokes at completely inappropriate times, not because they're cruel, but because they don't have the emotional intelligence to read when humor is appropriate versus when it's destructive. Or someone who's been told that loyalty is important, so they remain loyal to genuinely toxic, abusive people long past the point of reason, because they can't assess the quality of what they're being loyal to. Only the concept of loyalty itself. Psychologists refer to this as rule-based social processing versus principle-based social processing. High-intelligence individuals operate on principles. They can adapt rules to context. Low-intelligence individuals operate on rigid rules, and when the context changes, they fall apart socially. Here's the emotional reality of being close to someone like this. It's confusing because sometimes they seem fine, they say the right things, they do the expected things, but something always feels slightly off, like they're acting from a script they half memorized, and when you go off script, when life gets complicated or nuanced, they don't know what page to turn to. That's not phoniness in the malicious sense. It's cognitive limitation wearing the mask of social competence. The insight this gives you: when dealing with a rule-based social processor, be explicit. Don't assume they understand the why behind a request or expectation. State it clearly. They function far better with direct, concrete communication than with implied social norms, and manage your own expectations accordingly. You will never have the deep, nuanced emotional dialogue with them that you might have with someone of higher emotional and cognitive intelligence, and fighting that reality only hurts you. Einstein's definition of insanity: doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. For some people, this isn't insanity, it's just Tuesday. One of the most scientifically well-established correlates of low IQ is reduced ability to learn from experience. And this is not about formal education. This is about the most fundamental kind of learning, the kind where you do something, observe the consequence, and adjust your behavior. This is called experiential learning or feedback loop processing, and it requires a level of abstract thinking that lower IQ individuals genuinely struggle with. Here's how it plays out in real life. They make a financial decision that blows up. 6 months later, they make the same financial decision. You watch in disbelief. They say something that deeply hurts someone they love. The relationship fractures. You explain, carefully, why it was hurtful. 2 weeks later, they say something almost identical to someone else. They get into conflict with an authority figure, a boss, a landlord, a teacher, due to a specific behavior. They lose the job, the apartment, the grade, and then they repeat the behavior in the next situation. Why? Because connecting a present action to a future consequence requires temporal reasoning and abstract causal thinking. You have to be able to mentally simulate, if I do X now, Y will happen later. And that simulation requires cognitive horsepower that a low IQ brain simply doesn't generate reliably. The result is a person who seems to be constantly stumbling into the same wall, genuinely shocked each time it's there. Now, here's the human element that gets lost when we talk about this clinically. Imagine living like that. Imagine genuinely not being able to understand why things keep going wrong. Imagine feeling like life is a mystery that everyone else has the answer to, except you. That is isolating. That is painful. That produces the depression, the aggression, the social withdrawal that we so often see alongside low intelligence. The practical takeaway: if you're in a relationship, personal or professional, with someone caught in the repetition trap, adjust your strategy. Expecting them to learn the lesson the way you would is setting yourself up for repeated disappointment. Set systems, not expectations. Create structure around them. That's the only thing that reliably interrupts the loop. They don't fight to win the argument. They fight to destroy the conversation. This is the one I promised you at the beginning, and it's the one that's going to reframe someone in your life. Low-intelligence individuals, when cornered, challenged, or made to feel intellectually inferior, often resort to a very specific form of aggression, not calculated, not strategic, reactive. Psychologists call it low frustration tolerance combined with verbal aggression. And here's the mechanism. When a cognitively limited individual enters a conversation they cannot intellectually manage, the emotional system, as we discussed earlier, takes over. But unlike emotional expression in other contexts, this kind of emotional flooding turns outward. It becomes an attack. The goal, unconsciously, is not to win the argument. It's to end it. To create enough chaos, enough discomfort, enough emotional damage that the other person backs down or leaves. And because this strategy often works, because most people withdraw from escalating conflict, it gets reinforced. It becomes their go-to. This is why you've noticed that some people seem to have a hair trigger. The smallest intellectual challenge, and they're suddenly personal, suddenly attacking your character, your appearance, your past, things that have nothing to do with the topic. That's not passion, that's cognitive panic, dressed up as aggression. Here's the life example. You're at work. A colleague is explaining a process incorrectly. You politely correct them with evidence. Instead of engaging with the evidence, they snap. They bring up something unrelated. They question your motives. They go to the manager and frame the situation as a personal attack on them. Sound familiar? The terrifying reality is that this reactive aggression can escalate into something genuinely dangerous in intimate relationships. Research consistently shows a correlation between lower cognitive ability, lower frustration tolerance, and higher rates of domestic conflict and aggression. This is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. Your protection: never engage with someone in a state of cognitive panic. You will not win. You will not be heard. All you will do is absorb damage. Exit the conversation with as little escalation as possible. Return, if you must, only when the emotional temperature has dropped completely. And long-term, evaluate whether this relationship is genuinely serving you, because chronic exposure to reactive aggression rewires your own nervous system. That's not a metaphor. That's neuroscience. They don't want to be understood. They want to be agreed with. There's a massive difference. Here's a psychological pattern that ties everything together and explains so much of the confusing behavior we've been describing. Low IQ individuals have a disproportionately high need for external validation, and the reason goes directly back to the Dunning-Kruger foundation we laid at the beginning. If you lack the cognitive ability to accurately assess your own performance, you become dependent on others to tell you where you stand. You can't self-evaluate reliably, so external approval becomes the only mirror you trust. This produces a very specific and exhausting social dynamic. They need constant reassurance. They need to be told they're smart, right, capable, valuable, repeatedly, not once, not occasionally, constantly, because without that external input, the internal system has no stable reading. And when the validation stops, or when someone offers genuine, honest feedback, it collapses. Fast. Criticism, even constructive criticism, is experienced as an existential attack rather than useful information, because their entire sense of self is built on the external input they've been collecting. Remove that input, or challenge it, and the whole structure shakes. This is why you see low-intelligence individuals disproportionately drawn to social media feedback loops. The likes, the comments, the shares, these aren't entertainment, they're cognitive sustenance, and it's why they surround themselves with yes people, with groups and communities that only ever reflect their existing views back at them, not out of malice, out of psychological survival. The insight: if you want to maintain a functional relationship with someone operating this way, understand that honest feedback needs to be heavily framed before it's delivered. Lead with affirmation. Be specific. Be gentle, not because you're being dishonest, but because you're being effective. And set your own boundaries around how much validation you're willing to provide. Becoming someone's sole emotional supply is a path that leads to your own depletion. So let's bring this together, because we've covered a lot of psychological ground, and I want to make sure you walk away from this video with something real. We talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect, the paradox where the least competent are the most confident, and why that makes them almost impossible to reach through direct argument. We talked about emotional hijacking, how low IQ individuals use emotional flooding not as manipulation, but as a genuine cognitive escape when logic becomes too demanding. We talked about the blame architecture and how their inability to self-reflect traps the people around them in a cycle of false guilt. We talked about conspiracy comfort zones and how the brain, when overwhelmed by complexity, reaches for simple narratives with simple villains. We talked about social mimicry, the strange, hollow feeling of being with someone who says the right things without understanding why. We talked about the repetition trap and the heartbreaking reality of watching someone walk into the same wall, genuinely unable to see it coming. We talked about hidden aggression and how what looks like a personality problem is often a cognitive panic response in disguise. And we talked about validation hunger and how an unstable internal compass creates an insatiable need for external approval. Now, here is the most important thing I want to leave you with, and this is where I ask you to really think. This video was never about judgment. It was about understanding. Because here's the truth that sits underneath all of this. Intelligence, like height, like eyesight, like so many things, exists on a spectrum. And where someone falls on that spectrum is shaped by genetics, by environment, by early childhood experiences, by access to education, by trauma, by nutrition, by 100 variables that no one consciously chooses. The person in your life who fits these patterns, they didn't choose this. They're not the villain of your story, but they may be someone whose cognitive limitations are genuinely incompatible with the relationship you're trying to build with them. And recognizing that, clearly, honestly, without cruelty, is one of the most intelligent things you can do. Protect your energy, protect your emotional ecosystem, and use what you've learned here not as a weapon, but as a map. Because the people who understand human psychology at this level, they don't waste their time fighting battles that can't be won. They redirect, they strategize, they build the life they want around the obstacles, not against them. That's the Machiavellian way. If this video gave you something real, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. Which of these 8 patterns have you seen most in your own life? I read every single comment, and I'll see you in the next one.